They came from the edge of the world. They came from the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the frozen rivers of Russia. They were men raised on stories of wolves eating the sun. Men who believed that the only way to enter paradise was to die with a weapon in their hand. To the people of the South, the refined, educated citizens of the Roman Empire, they were monsters. They were giants with pale skin and blue eyes, smelling of wet wool and old iron. They spoke a language that sounded like stones grinding together. They drank until they passed out. They killed without hesitation. But in the year 988, the Emperor of the world did not need philosophers. He did not need poets. He needed monsters. We often think of Vikings as raiders. We picture them burning monasteries in England or terrorizing the coasts of France. But the greatest story of the Viking Age did not happen in the West. It happened in the East. It happened in the city of gold they called Miklagard here. The Vikings did not come to loot. They came to serve. They formed an elite unit that would become the stuff of legend. A unit so fearsome that their mere presence on a battlefield could stop a rebellion. A unit so loyal that they would stand and die to the last man while everyone else ran away. They carried the great Danish Axe, a weapon so heavy that a normal man could barely lift it. Yet they swung it with the speed of lightning. They wore the Emperor's gold on their arms and his wine in their bellies. They were the Varangian Guard. This is the story of how a band of pagan barbarians became the final line of defense for the Christian Empire. It is a story of impossible wealth, political betrayal, and a loyalty bought with blood, from the frozen north to the burning sands of the Middle East. This is the saga of the Emperor's Axe-men. Welcome to the Viking saga. ***, imagine, for a moment, that you are a young warrior from Scandinavia in the 10th century. Your world is small. It is made of wood and mud. Your village has perhaps 50 people. The largest building you have ever seen is a chieftain's longhouse, a smoky timber hall that smells of roasting meat and damp dogs. Your wealth is measured in silver arm rings and cattle. Your life is hard, cold, and likely short. But then you hear a rumor, a story told by a traveler who has rowed his ship down the great river systems of the East, down the Dnieper and the Volga, past the rapids, all the way to the southern sea. He tells you of a city not made of wood, but of marble and stone. A city where the domes of the temples are covered in gold that burns like fire in the sun. A city so large that it takes a man a full day to walk from one side to the other. He calls it the great city, the city of Michael. We know it as Constantinople. In the year 988 AD, Constantinople was the center of the universe. It was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. While London and Paris were just muddy settlements, Constantinople had a population of 500,000 people. It had paved streets lit by oil lamps at night. It had aqueducts bringing fresh water. It had the Hippodrome, a massive stadium where 100,000 people screamed for chariot races. And above it all rose the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. A building so immense that Vikings believed it must have been suspended from the heavens by chains, because no pillars could hold it for a Viking. Stepping off the boat onto the docks of the Golden Horn was like stepping onto another planet. The sensory overload must have been paralyzing. The smell of incense and spices instead of pine and rot. The sound of Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Persian spoken in the markets. The sight of silk, purple, dye, and glass. But beneath the gold, there was rot. Byzantium was rich, but it was treacherous. It was a snake pit of politics. Generals plotted against emperors. Eunuchs whispered in dark corridors. Mothers blinded their own sons to seize power. The current emperor, Basil II, was a young man sitting on a shaky throne. He was brilliant, but he was surrounded by enemies. Basil had a problem that every Roman emperor had faced for centuries. He could not trust his own army. The Byzantine generals were powerful aristocrats with their own ambitions. If Basil sent a Greek general to fight a war, that general might return with the army and take the crown for himself. The native troops were loyal to their commanders, not to the emperor. Basil needed a force that existed outside the system. He needed soldiers who had no family connections in the city, no political ambitions, no interest in the theological debates of the church. He needed men who wanted only two things: fighting and gold. And so he looked north. He looked to the Rus, the Swedish Vikings who had settled in Kiev. He made a deal with their prince, Vladimir, in exchange for a royal marriage, giving his own sister, a princess born in the purple. To a barbarian, Basil requested a tribute of warriors. Vladimir emptied his prisons. He emptied his barracks. He gathered the wildest, most violent, most uncontrollable men in his domain men. He was probably happy to get rid of them. He put them on ships. 6,000 of them. Imagine the sight as that fleet arrived in the Bosphorus. 6,000 giants, armed with shields painted with runes, their beards braided, their eyes hungry. The people of Constantinople watched from the sea walls in terror. They thought it was an invasion. They were wrong. It was the new security detail. When those 6,000 Vikings marched through the gates of the city, the history of warfare changed. They were not there to integrate. They were not there to learn Greek culture. They were there to be the axe bearers. And the first thing Basil II did was point them at his enemies and say, "Kill." The result was not a battle. It was a massacre. And out of that blood, the Guard was born. But to understand why they were so effective, we have to look at the tool they brought with them. A weapon that terrified the Romans more than the men themselves. We need to talk about the axe. The year is 989 AD. The winter winds are whipping across the Bosphorus. Emperor Basil II stands on the walls of Constantinople, looking out across the water. He is desperate. The rebel general Bardas Phocas has seized most of the empire. His armies are camped on the Asian shore, preparing for the final assault. Basil's own troops are deserting him. The priests are praying, but Basil knows that prayers do not stop swords. Then, the sails appear. They emerge from the Black Sea amidst hundreds of longships, low in the water, propelled by oars that beat with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. The Rus have arrived. Prince Vladimir of Kiev kept his word. He sent 6,000 men, but he didn't send his best men. He sent the troublemakers, the men too violent even for the violent, society of the Rus. He sent a purge. When these men landed on the shores of Chrysopolis, the rebel army laughed. What could barbarians do against disciplined Roman legions? The rebels were heavy cavalry, armored cataphracts, the finest soldiers in the east. They stopped laughing when the charge began. The Rus did not fight like Romans. They did not march in neat squares. They surged. They ran uphill, screaming the names of pagan gods, crashing into the rebel lines with the force of a landslide. The battle was not a contest. It was a butchery. The Rus pulled the rebel knights from their horses and hacked them to pieces on the ground. They broke the shield walls with sheer kinetic energy. Basil II watched from the distance. He saw something he had never seen before: absolute, unwavering ferocity. But more importantly, he saw loyalty. These men didn't care about the complex theology of the Orthodox Church. They didn't care about the political history of the Roman Senate. They didn't care who Bardas Phocas was. They had been paid to kill the enemies of the man in the purple robe. And they would keep killing until there were no enemies left. After the battle, the rebels were shattered. Phocas was dead. Basil's throne was safe. But Basil made a decision that would change history. He realized that he could never trust his Greek generals again. They were too ambitious. They were too connected. But these barbarians, they had no family in Constantinople. They had no land to protect. They had no political allies. They were hated by the populace, which meant they could only rely on one person for their survival: the emperor. They were the perfect bodyguards. Basil took the survivors of that battle, paid them a fortune in gold, and formalized them into a new regiment. He called them the Tagmatun Varangian, the Varangian Guard. Varangian comes from the Old Norse Varar, meaning oath. They were the men of the pledge, the sworn ones. They were given the best barracks in the city. They were given the right to bear arms inside the imperial palace, a privilege denied even to Roman generals. And they were given a specific duty: to stand beside the emperor, day and night, and to act as the physical extension of his will. If the emperor pointed a finger, a head rolled, and the tool they used to remove those heads became the symbol of their power. Asterisk in the history of warfare. Most elite units are defined by their discipline or their armor. The Varangian Guard was defined by a single object. The Byzantines called them the pelikaphoroi, the axe-bearers. To understand why this weapon was so feared, you have to understand the military technology of the time. The 10th and 11th centuries were the age of the shield and the mail hauber. A sword is a cutting tool. Against heavy chainmail, a sword can glance off. A spear is a piercing tool. It can be deflected. But the Dane Axe is different. It is not a tool of finesse. It is a tool of physics. The axe used by the guard was massive. The haft was up to 6 feet long, made of ash or oak. The head was made of iron with a welded steel edge, broad and thin, shaped like a crescent moon. It was a two-handed weapon. This meant the Varangian had to sling his shield over his back to use it. He was exposing his chest to use his weapon. This was a psychological statement. I do not need to defend myself. I am here to destroy you. The mechanics of the Dane Axe are terrifying. Because of the length of the handle, the head travels at incredible speed. When it strikes, it delivers a massive amount of kinetic energy concentrated on a very small edge. Contemporary chroniclers, like Michael Sellows and Anna Comnin, wrote in horror about what this weapon did to a human body. They described the axe cleaving through helmets and splitting skulls down to the teeth. They describe it cutting through the neck of a horse to decapitate the rider in a single swing. They describe it shattering shields like kindling against the intricate, lighter armor of the Arabs in the east. The axe was devastating. Against the heavy mail of the Normans in the west, it was a canopy. But the Guard was not just a mob of berserkers with axes. They evolved. This is what made them the elite Viking squad. They adapted. When a Viking arrived in Constantinople, he brought his axe and his strength. But the Empire gave him something he never had in the north: high-tech armor. The Emperor outfitted his guards with the best protection money could buy. They wore heavy Byzantine lamella, armor scales of steel or hardened leather, laced together. They wore greaves on their shins and vambraces on their arms. They wore helmets with chainmail aventails protecting the neck. Imagine the sight. A man who is already naturally larger than the average Mediterranean, standing perhaps 6 feet tall. He is draped in heavy, gold-plated steel. He is wearing a cloak of imperial purple silk, and resting on his shoulder is a 6-foot executioner's axe. They stood like statues around the throne during diplomatic receptions. Foreign ambassadors would walk into the hall, intending to threaten the emperor, and then they would see the palace dogs. They would see the blue eyes staring out from under the helmets. They would see the axes, and they would suddenly become very polite. The weapon was a deterrent. But when deterrence failed, the guard was unleashed. They were the fire brigade of the empire. Whenever a battle line was crumbling, the emperor would send in the Varangians. They didn't maneuver. They didn't use complex tactics. They simply walked toward the enemy and began to chop. The sound of the axes hitting the enemy line was said to be distinct rhythmic, wet thudding that drowned out the screams. But life in the guard wasn't just about war. It was about managing the boredom of peace. And when you give 6,000 Viking warriors unlimited wine and gold, and put them in the most decadent city on earth, problems arise. They were loyal, yes, but they were also loud, drunk, and dangerous. The Byzantines had a nickname for them that wasn't axe-bearers. It was the emperor's winebags. To understand their life inside the palace, we have to look at the luxury that surrounded them, the temptation that eventually led to their greatest heist. War is hell, but peace is dangerous in a different way. For the Varangians, life in Constantinople was a surreal dream. These were men who grew up in windowless wooden huts, eating dried fish and porridge. Now they lived in the Mangana, a palace complex built specifically for them. They slept on silk. They ate spiced meat. They bathed in heated marble pools. But the Byzantines didn't treat them like civilized men. They treated them like dangerous pets, like lions kept on a gold chain. The nickname given to them by the court officials was the emperor's winebags vinabablia. The Varangians drank heavily. It was part of their culture. In the north, drinking was a communal bond, a way to boast and bond. But in the heat of the Mediterranean, with unlimited access to sweet Greek wine, the drinking became legendary. There are records of Varangians stumbling through the streets of Constantinople, singing loud pagan songs, smashing pottery, and terrifying the locals. But no one dared to stop them. You do not arrest the man holding the axe that protects the king. However, their drunkenness had a limit. In hundreds of years of service, there is almost no record of a Varangian betraying the emperor while on duty. When they put on the helmet, the wine stopped. Their loyalty was absolute. This loyalty was not based on love. It was based on a cold, hard calculation. The Varangians had a unique right, a custom written into their contract, known in Old Norse as polyt. It translates roughly to palace pillage. This is one of the most fascinating clauses in military history. The deal was simple. As long as the emperor was alive, the Varangians would die for him. They would take an arrow for him. They would stand against 1,000 men for him, but the moment the emperor died, the contract was void. The moment the breath left the emperor's body, the Varangians had the legal right to run to the imperial treasury. They could take as much gold, jewelry, and gems as they could physically carry in their hands. Imagine the scene. The emperor lies dead in his bedchamber. The weeping priests are praying. and in the hallway, the elite bodyguards are sprinting toward the vault, grabbing handfuls of gold coins, stuffing rubies into their pockets, filling their helmets with pearls. It was a severance package unlike any other. It ensured that the guard had a vested interest in keeping the emperor alive as long as possible, but it also rewarded them when the inevitable end came. This unique economy attracted warriors from all over the north. It became a rite of passage. If you were a young Viking who wanted to be rich, you didn't raid a village in England. That was small change. You went to You served for 10 years, and you returned home with enough gold to buy a kingdom. And in the year 1034, a man arrived who wanted exactly that. He was not just a soldier. He was a fugitive prince. He stood 7 feet tall. He had eyebrows so fair one was higher than the other, and he had a hunger for power that would burn down half the world. His name was Harald. History knows him as Harald Hardrada. Asterisk, if the Varangian Guard was a movie, Harald Hardrada would be the main character. He is the archetype of the Viking hero, brilliant, cruel, poetic, and utterly unstoppable. He arrived in Constantinople at the age of 19. He was in exile. His half-brother, Saint Olaf, had been killed in battle in Norway. Harald had been wounded, hunted, and forced to flee across Russia. He arrived at the gates of Miklagard, not as a beggar, but with a retinue of 500 loyal men he had gathered on the way. He didn't just join the guard, he transformed it. The empress at the time was Zoe Porphyrogenita, a woman famous for her beauty, her jealous rages, and her habit of marrying men and then getting rid of them. She took a liking to Harald. She saw in him a weapon. Harald was too high-ranking to be a simple door guard. He was given command of a unit and sent out to the frontiers of the empire to do what Vikings did best, pirate. For the next 8 years, Harald Hardrada treated the Mediterranean Sea like his own private swimming pool. He fought Arab pirates in the Aegean Sea. He took his axe to the Saracens in Asia Minor. He marched all the way to Jerusalem to protect the Holy Sepulchre and arguably to loot the surrounding area. The sagas tell us he fought in 18 pitched battles. He never lost. But Harald was not just fighting for glory. He was fighting for the fund. Every city he sacked, every pirate ship he captured, he kept a portion of the loot. But he didn't keep it on him. He sent it back. He sent ships loaded with gold, silk, and gems north to Novgorod to be held in trust by the Russian prince, Yaroslav. He was building a war chest. He was saving up to buy Norway. His brutality became legendary. In one siege against a Sicilian city, the walls were too high to climb. So, Harald used his brain. He noticed that the birds nesting in the city flew out to the fields during the day to eat, and returned to the thatched roofs of the city at night. Harald ordered his men to catch the birds. They tied small slivers of burning wood to the birds' legs and released them. The birds flew back to their nests in the city. Thousands of them. The roofs caught fire. The city panicked. The gates opened, and the Varangians walked in. This was the mind of the man protecting the emperor. A tactical genius who used nature itself as a weapon. By the year 1042, Harald was the most famous warrior in the world. He was rich. He was a commander of the guard. He was the favorite of the empress. But in Byzantium, favor is a dangerous thing. The political winds shifted. Empress Zoe's new husband, Emperor Michael V, grew jealous of the giant Northmen. He feared Harald's power. He feared that the guard was more loyal to Harald than to the throne. And so, the trap was sprung. Harald was not honored for his service. He was accused of embezzlement. He was accused of defiling a noblewoman. The hero of the empire was thrown into a dungeon. Most men would have died there, but most men are not Harald Hardrada. The Viking Age was about to see its greatest prison break. Harald Hardrada sat in the dark. The dungeon of Constantinople was a pit designed to break the minds of men. It was damp, infested with vermin, and silent. For a normal man, this would be the end. But Harald was not normal. He was a man who had survived the frozen wastes of Russia and the burning deserts of Syria. To him, a prison was just a waiting room. According to the sagas, Harald received a vision from his dead half-brother, Saint Olaf, who told him the time had come. But historically, it was likely something more tangible, a revolution. The streets of Constantinople exploded. The people hated the new emperor, Michael V. They wanted their empress, Zoe, back on the throne. The mob stormed the palace. The city was burning. In the chaos, the loyal Varangians, those who were loyal to Harald, not the usurper, broke down the prison doors. Harald emerged from the darkness, not as a fugitive, but as an avenging angel. He rallied his men. He didn't flee immediately. He had a job to do. The Empress Zoe was restored to power, and she wanted vengeance on the man who had imprisoned her. She gave the order. Harald and his Varangians dragged the deposed Emperor Michael V to the street. They held him down, and in a final act of brutal poetic justice, Harald Hardrada himself, the barbarian from the north, took the red-hot poker and blinded the Emperor of Rome. With the deed done, Harald knew his time was up. He was too dangerous to be kept alive. He needed to leave, and he needed to take his gold with him. He loaded 2 longships with the plunder of a decade of war. But there was a problem. The Golden Horn, the harbor of Constantinople, was sealed. A massive iron chain, each linked the size of a man's torso, was stretched across the water to prevent ships from entering or leaving without permission. Harald's escape plan is one of the greatest feats of seamanship in history. He ordered his men to row the 2 ships at full speed toward the chain. As they approached the iron barrier, he ordered everyone on the ship to run to the back. The weight shifted aft. The prow of the front of the ship lifted up out of the water. The ship hit the chain. The keel ground against the iron, sliding up and onto it like a sled. At the moment of balance, when the ship was perched on top of the chain, Harald screamed the second order. Forward. Every man sprinted to the front of the ship. The weight shifted forward. The ship tipped over the chain and splashed down into the open sea on the other side. The second ship wasn't so lucky. It broke its back and sank. But Harald made it. He sailed north, back to Russia, then to Norway, to become the king who would eventually invade England. But while Harald left, the guard remained. And soon, a new wave of recruits would arrive. Men who were not driven by greed, but by a hate so deep it burned like acid. The year is 1066. The year the Viking Age effectively ended in the West. At the Battle of Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson was killed. England fell to William the Conqueror and his Norman knights. For the English nobility, the Huscarls' life under Norman rule was intolerable. They lost their lands. They lost their titles. They were hunted men in their own country, so they did what exiles have always done. They looked for a new war. A massive fleet of English refugees, perhaps as many as 350 ships. sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. They arrived in Constantinople in the 1070s. The emperor at the time, Alexios Komnenos, welcomed them with open arms. He knew the reputation of the English husk. They fought with the same heavy axes as the Vikings. Almost overnight, the makeup of the Varangian Guard changed. It was no longer dominated by Scandinavians. It became the England Varangue, the English Guard. These men were different from the Rus. They didn't come for adventure. They came for revenge. The Normans who had conquered England were also expanding into the Mediterranean, attacking Byzantine lands in Greece and Sicily. For the English Varangians, this was a dream come true. The emperor was paying them to kill the very same people who had stolen their homes. This hatred came to a head at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081. The Byzantine army faced the Norman army of Robert Guiscard. The English Varangians were in the front line. When they saw the Normans, discipline collapsed. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't form a shield wall. They were consumed by the red mist. They charged. They were fueled by 15 years of bitterness. They smashed into the Norman lines, hacking with their axes, driving the enemy back into the sea. They were winning, but their rage was their undoing. They advanced too far, separating themselves from the main Byzantine army. The Normans, experienced tacticians, regrouped and surrounded them. The English retreated to a small church, the Church of St. Nicholas, to make a final stand. The Normans didn't bother to storm the doors. They simply piled wood around the church and set it on fire. The English Varangians burned to death, weapons in hand, fighting the same enemy that had killed their fathers at Hastings. It was a tragedy, but it cemented their reputation. They were men who would rather burn than surrender. This loyalty would be tested one final time, 100 years later, in the darkest day of the empire's history. When the Crusaders came, the year is 1204. The Viking Age is over in the north. The pagan gods are dead. But in Constantinople, the spirit of the Guard is still alive, preserved in the amber of imperial tradition. However, the enemy standing at the gates is not a pagan horde. It is not an Arab army. It is something far worse. It is an army of fellow Christians. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to go to Jerusalem, but through a twisted series of political deals, debts, and greed, the massive fleet of Western Knights, French, German, and Venetian, diverted to Constantinople. They didn't come to pray. They came to collect. Leading them was the blind doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, a man who hated Byzantium with a passion that burned brighter than Greek fire. Standing on the sea walls, looking down at the Venetian ships, were the Varangians. But these were not the Rus of old. These were the sons of the English exiles. They wore the heavy armor of the East, but they gripped their axes with Anglo-Saxon hands. When they looked down at the Franks and Normans in the boats below, they didn't just see invaders. They saw the people who had stolen their country in 1066. This wasn't just a siege. It was a grudge match, 150 years in the making. The assault began on April 12th. It was a nightmare of noise and fire. The Venetian ships built massive flying, bridges wooden platforms suspended from the masts that allowed their knights to swing directly onto the top of the city walls. The Varangians met them there. For hours, the battle was a meat grinder. The chronicles described the Varangians hacking the armored knights apart as they tried to cross the bridges. The axe-bearers were the only thing holding the line. The Greek troops, demoralized and unpaid, were already melting away. But the Varangians fought with a terrifying discipline. They weren't fighting for the emperor anymore. The emperor, Alexios V, was a coward who was already packing his bags to flee. They were fighting for their reputation. They were fighting because an oath, once given, is written in iron. But bravery cannot stop physics. The Crusaders set fires inside the city to create chaos. The wind shifted. The flames turned into a firestorm that consumed a third of the city. The gates were breached. The Latin knights poured into the streets of the Queen of Cities like a plague of locusts. As the city burned, the Varangian Guard fell back. They retreated to the one place they were sworn to protect, the Great Palace. This is the final, tragic scene of the Guard as a military force. Imagine them, a few hundred, perhaps 1,000 men, standing on the steps of the Bucolian Palace. Their armor is black with soot. Their axes are notched and dull from hours of killing. Inside the palace, the emperor had fled. The bureaucracy had collapsed. There was no one left to give orders. The Crusader army halted at the foot of the steps. They saw the wall of axes. Even with the city conquered, they hesitated to attack the Guard head-on. The Varangians stood there, waiting for the order to charge, waiting for the glorious death that leads to Valhalla or heaven. But the order never came. Instead, a messenger arrived. The new Latin conquerors offered a deal. Surrender, and you will be spared. Fight, and you will die for a city that has already fallen. In the sagas, the heroes always choose death. But history is more pragmatic. The Varangians looked at the burning city. They looked at the empty throne behind them. They realized that their contract was void. The emperor was gone. And so, for the first time in 200 years, the Varangians lowered their axes. They did not surrender out of cowardice. They surrendered because there was nothing left to save. The Crusaders sacked the city for 3 days. They looted the Hagia Sophia, tearing the gold from the altar. They melted down the ancient bronze statues of Greek heroes to make coins. They destroyed the library of Constantinople, burning the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. The Varangians watched it happen. The city they had sworn to protect was being eaten alive by the soldiers of Christ. The Guard survived the sack, but they were never the same. They became a ceremonial unit, a shadow of the giants who had once blinded emperors. The axe was replaced by the halberd. The roar of the Rus was replaced by polite court ritual. But before they faded completely into the mist of history, one of them left a message. A final signature carved into the very heart of the empire. A message that proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Northmen were there. Asterisk, the fires of the Fourth Crusade eventually burned out. The Latin knights took their plunder and went home, leaving behind a broken city. The Byzantine Empire did eventually recover in 1261. The Greeks retook Constantinople, but the glory days were gone. The treasury was empty. The Golden Age was over, and with the gold went the Guard. The Varangian Guard continued to exist on paper for another 200 years, but they were a shadow of the giants who had blinded emperors. They were no longer the elite shock troops recruited from the frozen fjords of Norway or the angry exiles of England. They became a ceremonial relic. They were men who carried axes during parades, but rarely swung them in anger. The axe, once a symbol of terror that could stop a rebellion with a single blow, it became just a decoration. By the time the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, the Varangians had vanished into the mist. Their barracks at the Mangana were empty. Their great halls, where they had drunk wine and boasted of their kills, were silent. The axes rusted into red dust. The bones of 6,000 men were buried in unmarked graves beneath the city streets, paved over by the march of time. History usually belongs to the kings and the generals. We remember Basil the Bulgus. We remember Harald Hardrada because he became a king. But the common soldier, the man who stood watch in the rain, the man who took an arrow in the throat to save a master who didn't know his name, he is forgotten. He dissolves into the earth. But sometimes history hides in plain sight. Sometimes a soldier leaves a message that outlasts the empire he served. If you travel to Istanbul today, you will find yourself standing before the Hagia Sophia. For 1,000 years, it was the largest cathedral in the world. It is a building designed to make you feel small. The dome floats above you like a golden cloud. The walls are covered in mosaics of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the Seraphim. It is a place of overwhelming holiness. But if you ignore the dome, if you walk up the stone ramp to the upper gallery, to the southern balustrade, and you look closely at the white marble railing, you will see something that doesn't belong. It is faint. Millions of hands have touched it over the centuries, wearing the stone smooth. Most tourists walk right past it, but if the light hits the marble at the exact right angle, you can see scratches. They are not random cracks. They are not mistakes. They are letters. They are runes. In 1964, experts finally deciphered the inscription. It is not a prayer. It is not a quote from the Bible. It is a piece of vandalism. A graffiti tag carved by a bored soldier with the tip of his knife. It reads, "Halfdan carved these runes." Stop and think about that for a second. Halfdan, we don't know his last name. We don't know if he was Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish. We don't know if he died in battle or retired rich. All we know is that he was a man born in a wooden hut on the edge of the known world. A man who rode across the stormy Baltic, who dragged his ship over the deadly rapids of the Dnieper River, who survived the disease and the wars of the Mediterranean. He found himself standing in the most holy church in all of Christendom, likely during a boring coronation ceremony or a long Easter Mass. He was standing guard, surrounded by incense and chanting priests, and he was bored. So, just like a modern kid scratching his name into a school desk, Halfdan took his knife and carved his signature into the marble of the Roman Empire. He wasn't trying to make history. He was just trying to pass the time. But in doing so, he achieved a kind of immortality that the emperors he protected could only dream of. The emperors are dust. Their palaces are ruins. But Halfdan's name is still there, and he wasn't the only one. Nearby, another inscription reads, "Ari made these runes." Another is illegible, worn away by 1,000 years of friction. These scratches are the most human connection we have to the Varangian Guard. They strip away the myth of the bloodthirsty barbarian and show us the person, a man far from home, a man trying to leave a mark on a world that was so much bigger and so much stranger than the one he came from. Asterisk, asterisk, we started this journey in the cold mud of Scandinavia. We end it in the warm marble halls of Istanbul. The story of the Varangian Guard is the story of the Viking Age itself. It is a story of expansion, a story of how a people from the edge of the map pushed outward until they touched the very center of civilization. They were mercenaries, yes. They fought for gold, not for God. They were winebags and barbarians. But when the arrows were flying and the city was burning, they were the only ones who didn't run. In a world of treachery, they were the one constant. The emperor could not trust his brother. He could not trust his mother. He could not trust his generals. But he could trust the man with the axe. The watch is over now. The contract is fulfilled. But if you listen closely in the quiet corners of the Hagia Sophia, you might still hear the echo of a heavy boot on stone, and the whisper of a language that belongs to the wolves and the snow. Halfdan was here, and because of him, the empire survived. This has been the Viking Saga. Thank you for watching, **.